People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. On this episode, I am talking with Samm Deighan and Andrew Nette. What? Those are co-hosts. What are they doing being interviewed by me? Well, I'll tell you, they are the co-editors of the new film, Revolution in 35mm, Political Violence and Resistance in Cinema from the Arthouse to the Grindhouse, 1960 to 1990. This book is in my sweet spot. There are so many movies surrounding 1969, May 68, just the late 60s turmoil, early 70s turmoil, obviously turmoil all the way from 1960 to 1990. I do have to say that I have an essay in this book, so take that with a grain of salt, though I don't talk about it too much in this interview. Wrote a little bit about Peter Watkins and people hunting people films. If you want to hear more about people hunting people films, well, check out our turkey shoot episode with Mr. Nette that's coming out pretty darn soon, I believe in October. And of course, Sam has been on so many episodes, as well as Andrew, but this is also in Sam's sweet spot of post-World War II world cinema. You know that Sam is quite a cinephile, as well as Andrew, and will recommend movies that I've never heard of, and that's pretty good. This is another book that's going to put a lot of titles on your wish list, on your watch list. I imagine somebody is going to go out and make a list of all of the movies that have been covered in this book and throw that onto Letterboxd. If they do, if somebody's got that kind of time on their hands, boy oh boy, I will be the first one to link to it. Definitely check out this book. It is available via PM Press. You can also get it wherever finer books are sold. If they don't have it at your local bookstore, hopefully you have a local bookstore, they can order it for you. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Andrew Nette, Samm Deighan, the co-editors of Revolution in 35mm. I have my beautiful copy of it right here. I am so thrilled with this book, and even more that you guys asked me to be a part of it. How did this project come about?
I knew that I wanted to write something book length about political violence in cinema, but I didn't know exactly what that project might look like. And I was picking Andrew's brain about working with PM Press. And I think how it happened was I described the project and you were like, I'll be a co-editor. And that was pretty much that, right?
I'll just invite myself into your book. That's right, yes. You had that idea, which, was a great idea, and synced with a couple of things I've been thinking about. And I thought it would be a good project for PM. And PM do beautiful books, as this one is. They do beautiful full colour books. They certainly do the kind of books that I would never be able to do in Australia. So I pitched it to Ramsey Keenan, who's the sort of head honcho at PM Press, and he said yes. So give us a proposal. That was that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I didn't try to do a book like this on my own. Like, I think for a lot of different reasons, it makes sense as a group project with like different people writing different essays. And I don't know, it's just, I think, sure, someone could do a solo book like this, but I think it's just so much better the way that it turned out.
Where did the idea of taking this around the globe come from? Was that right there at the original pitch, as far as we want to look at Revolution on film around the entire world? Because you cover, obviously not every single country, but a lot of them, that's for sure.
Yeah, we tried. I guess to me, where it came from was when I first started writing, I got pretty pigeonholed into writing about horror genre films, and it made me feel frustrated because it's one note to just be writing about one genre or subgenre again and again. And I started thinking about representations of violence in film that are not in horror films. And it's just something I've started thinking about more and more over probably the last decade. And so when we talked about turning it into an actual edited collection of essays, it was, we might as well, what's the widest scope? And I think that part was the hardest to narrow down, is like, what do you leave out? Because there's so much.
Yeah, for my part, I had co-edited 3 books with PM Press previously, and they were looking at aspects of pulp and popular publishing over the period that, for want of a better word, a lot of people call, or certainly a lot of academics call, the long 60s, which is that notion that the 60s really had their genesis, obviously, in the 1950s, and the sort of political, social, economic changes that happened in the 60s reverberate all the way really into the 1980s. So this book was a good fit with that. And I was a bit sick of writing about pulp and popular fiction. I was actually quite keen to do something different, and I was really interested to do something on film. And Samm was certainly someone whose work I had admired for a long time. And so it was great to work with her on this. And it was great to do something which stretched me in terms of writing about film for a book project and writing about a whole lot of films that I was really interested in, but which I hadn't written about before. And as Samm said, there were many complicated aspects of the book, but one of them was how you narrow it down, because there is so much. So we had to have the sort of the key ones. We have to have Godard, we have to have Gillo Pontecorvo, Costas Gavras, films like Z. Those are your basic ones that you just can't avoid having, and you should have them. But then there's also a huge swathe of material that then became quite difficult to sort through, and what we include and what we don't include. Yeah, that was a sort of continual, a good dynamic tension in the project right up almost until we submitted the manuscript.
Yeah, it was like towards the end there, it was like, what final essays can we shoehorn into this book? Because we both just kept finding stuff that we're genuinely really excited about, which is the best feeling for a book project, rather than being like, what else do we have to include?
And also a sort of truncating our desire, or the possibility that you could just pretty much do the entire book on Italy. And within that, you could almost do the entire book on Gian Maria Valente, the spirit animal of the book, because he's in so many of the films that we wanted to do, and we're really trying to. Yeah, there's a lot of Valente in the book, which is a good thing.
I haven't spoken to both of you about a Valente. I'm sure that, he is. I mean, right there on the cover. So how did you determine that size of the box as far as what was going to go into this and what wasn't?
Something that I have trouble reckoning with in my writing in general is like more mainstream cinema, which I often find to be, a lot of it is just like capitalist propaganda cleverly spun into something else, at least if you're talking about political violence in films. So once we figured out, okay, we could do art house movies and other like marginal things, like different types of genre cinema, the subtitle is From the Arthouse to the Grindhouse. It's like that still alone could be like 10 volumes, but at least it narrowed it a little bit.
A lot of it's also about, with these projects, it's what you want and what you can find people to write about. We were paying contributors, but they weren't being paid a huge amount. And so to get people who can write well, write the kind of stuff we wanted in the book, but also something that they wanted to contribute. And that was a bit of a push and pull too, which is a good thing, us approaching people and saying, do you want to write about this? But also people saying, oh, look, yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I'd be quite interested. I've got an idea to do this, and then shaping that idea is important. And I think also with this material, and this is a sort of commonality with the books I'd done for PM Press about pulp and popular fiction. I did one book with all 3 of those were done with a friend of mine in Melbourne called Ian McIntyre. And one book we did was about representations of youth deviancy and popular culture and pulp and popular fiction. And we also did a book on how the long 60s in terms of revolutionary countercultural movements were depicted in pulp and popular fiction, and we did one on science fiction as well, on radical science fiction. But the difficulty is that the material is, I don't want to say those words hasn't aged well or is controversial or is problematic, because they're all massive weasel words and I absolutely hate them, and there is no mention of any of those terms in the book. But it takes a certain skill to write perceptively and sensitively about material that a lot of people find easy to dismiss because it's exploitative, or it's got a lot of violence in it, or it's got a lot of sex in it, or there's sexual violence, or all those things. So you've got to be able to write about it in such a way that you're paying that material its respect, looking at why it came out and the roots of that material, and good in that material and what's interesting in that material, but also what can be difficult in that material, but in a way that's not looking down on the material. It's hard to write about some of that culture well, I think, in a non-sneering way, in not an overly academic way, in a way that recognizes this material as connected to radical directors, or for the most part, and radical movements, or even just radical milieus, or is influenced by that, even if it's sometimes unconsciously influenced by that.
Annie Rose Malamet wrote this chapter about rape revenge films, especially the rape revenge films focused around like girl gangs, and tied it to politics and to second wave feminism in such an interesting way, where I definitely feel like she's the only person who could have written that chapter in that way, because to have someone write about rape revenge films and take them seriously while also not trying to spin them into something bigger than they actually are or weightier than they actually are. They're exploitation movies. But to connect it with these more very angry, violent, at least in terms of language, feminist writers and feminist movements, to me, it just, that's really, I think, sums up what we are going for, is like people who take the political content seriously, but can also write about films, whether it's an art house film or a low budget exploitation movie, with the same level of respect. And I feel like you did a very similar thing with your essay about these films from Peter Watkins and from other people too, where you have all these sort of futuristic humans hunting humans and it being broadcast on television. Like, I've definitely read some online writing about those films that is so disrespectful of them. And I think everyone who contributed to the book had a similar level of taking the subject matter seriously and being, not to use the same word 12 times in one paragraph, but respectfully.
Well, tell me about some of your other contributors.
We have an interesting mix of fiction writers, academics, film critics. Like, we have Matthew Kowalski writing about Yugoslavian cinema and the Yugoslavian Black Wave. And he's a really wonderful academic who has contributed to some Blu-ray releases. I know he did something for Working Class Goes to Heaven for the Radiance release. But mostly he's an academic who focuses on Eastern Europe and Soviet Union and is just so knowledgeable in that area, but also is somebody with communist radical politics. So it's like when he writes about it, you could tell that he's super, super passionate.
Another contributor, someone I know from Melbourne, is a fiction author called Christos Chalkis. His parents were Greek immigrants to Australia in the 1960s, I'm pretty sure. He's gay, comes from a working class Greek migrant family, and I knew that he was really interested in the work of Costa Gavras. So I asked him if he would be interested in looking at what is Gavras's most famous film, which is Z, or Z, depending on which part of the world that you come from. And he was keen to do it, and he did a really interesting take on that film, which I hadn't read anywhere else actually, about how it intersected with his own awakening as a queer person, and also basically how it intersected with his own working class politics coming up in radical Greek sort of communist movements in or 1980s, which is really good.
There's also Michael Gonzalez, who wrote his piece is similar to Christos's in the way that they both feel really personal. So he wrote this great essay about the spook who sat by the door, which, you couldn't have a book like this without covering that film. And he talks about what it was like to grow up watching it. And it strikes this really great balance between being a more journalistic piece about the history of this incredible film that got buried, and also just what it meant to him as, I think he grew up in Baltimore. Is that right?
I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn. I'm pretty sure it was Brooklyn, but he now lives in Baltimore, yeah.
I think that's where I was getting that mixed up. But like talking about his experience watching it as a young Black kid growing up, seeing it especially present themes so differently than the stereotypical blaxploitation movies. And who else do we have? We've also got Robert Skvarla, who specializes, he does some film writing, but he is mostly a kind of journalistic writer about conspiracy theories. Like he's written a lot about the CIA's involvement in popular culture and things like that. And he wrote about The Killing of America, which is this Mondo movie from the early 80s. And just this history of the Mondo films as being this weird mashup of pseudo-documentary and exploitation movie. And a lot of them really focus on violence as being this sort of foundational component of American society.
Yeah, another one was Kimberly Lindbergh's, who is another US-based writer, pop sort of film critic whose work I have liked for a long time now. She's great, and she did a terrific chapter on films that look at sort of American campus revolt films from the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly focusing on Antonioni's Zabriskie Point in 1970, which is, I suppose, another one of those films that you can't do a book like this without doing Zabriskie Point. And I think that, interestingly, a film I had seen ages ago and hadn't really cared very much for, but when I read Kimberly's writing on this film, and she actually writes about half a dozen other films as well as Zabriskie Point. She also does The Strawberry Statement, Getting Straight. But when I read her piece and read what she was saying about Zabriskie Point, I went back and revisited it and got a lot more out of it this time, which is one of the things I also really loved about doing this book, is discovering new films, but also reading what our contributors had said about the films and then going back and visiting them based on that. And that's something I also did while we were working with Christos on his chapter on Z. I went back and revisited that film, and I got a lot more out of it with the richness of what Christos was saying about it.
Yeah, there's similarly for me, Scott Adlerberg wrote this chapter about Brazilian cinema novo, comparing Glauber Rocha to Coffin Joe. And growing up watching Coffin Joe movies, like bootlegged bad transfer VHS tapes, to reread something about him in that context of his films having this component of political resistance made me think about them in a whole new way. Like at first when he pitched the essay, because we knew we wanted someone to do Brazilian cinema, like you could do a version of this book just focused on Central and South American cinema. But his pitch of comparing the two of them, in my head, I was like, how is he going to make this work? But it works. And it's such an interesting comparison.
Along with Central and South America, I'm sure you could do a whole book just on Africa and African cinema.
Yeah, that was one of my sort of rabbit holes that I fell down, where I wrote about Sarah Malderer and Ousmane Sembène, and also Youssef Chahine, who's an Egyptian filmmaker. Writing those essays closer to when we were finishing up the manuscript was a really positive experience, because some of those films are more hopeful in a lot of ways, especially knowing that a lot of these African countries, while these films were being made, were able to successfully win their wars of liberation and throw off the colonial governments. It was a nice thing to dive into after writing these depressing European chapters. Or like the new German cinema one, it's just so doom and gloom. It's like we're being repressed by these former Nazis. Having a couple of those African essays to write, again, you could do a whole book on African cinema and probably some African writers as well, just like the whole diaspora.
Even while we've been doing this book, it feels like the ground shifted a little bit because Sam and I have been talking about how, oh, look, Criterion's doing a season of these films, and Australian Centre for the Moving Image did a season of films on Zambeni earlier this year. So the stuff that we thought was very hard to find is suddenly getting a sort of a new look, which is nice. Although there's a lot of lost film in the book, or a lot of very hard to find film cultures that have been really, to use the in vogue term, erased by various things, or lost. And a lot of that is obviously in the global south, but also in America. There was this really interesting American director, I don't know whether you've heard of him, called Robert Kramer. I wrote an essay quite late in the piece about a 1970 Kramer film called Ice, which is essentially about this student worker revolution in America in 1970. Quite a strange film, but all of Kramer's filmography is really hard to find, almost impossible to find in some respects. And let's just say that we had to get creative in terms of sourcing some of the films.
Yeah, it is interesting, though, from when we started talking about it and initially plotting an outline to now that the book is out, it does feel like there's just something in the air because, like, Criterion has that Youssef Shaheen series on the channel. They put out some Ousmane Sembène films recently. Fingers crossed, maybe some of those harder to find films will start to materialize. Some of it, I think, like writing about Egyptian cinema and trying to do more writing about Middle Eastern cinema, it was shocking to me to learn like how little there is in certain areas because of the way the governments are set up and because of the way cinema is managed. So it's like from certain regions, you just have this explosion of political violence and revolution on screen in films. And then in other regions, you could just hear the crickets chirping.
Well, I mean, we were talking about this in a recent episode of an as yet unpublic episode of your podcast that's coming up. And we're talking about Youssef Shaheen's Jamila the Algerian, which is a 1950 film that he did about the sort of revolution in Algeria, very much focused on a female figure in that revolution. We were talking about the fact that Shaheen himself, I think, did a large number of films and the characters in that film. Now, some of those were in 60, 70. There's one guy in that film that it was in 132 Egyptian films, and it makes you realize that there's this whole body of film out there that you're completely ignorant about.
For some of those Egyptian films, you have to really like melodramas and musicals.
Well, speaking of melodramas and musicals, I was really happy that you have Indian films represented as well.
And none of them are melodramas or musicals. Yeah, that was actually really exciting that we were able to get. So this Indian film writer, Uday Bhatia, wrote this book about Indian crime cinema. And he wrote a chapter for our book about these gangster films that kind of a little bit like what Melville does and what some of the French 60s and 70s crime directors do. A lot of these Indian gangster movies, which are, again, incredibly difficult to find for English-friendly releases, they are similarly all about how gangsters and these organized crime gangs are basically created by the conditions of poverty and colonialism and government corruption. And it fit right in. And we knew there's so much more with Indian cinema you could do in a book like this. It just finding somebody with that expertise. So we're so grateful that Uday came on board.
Were there any areas of the globe that you wanted to have representation from, but were unable to find somebody to pen something?
I think some of it was an issue of word count. So I really wanted to do another Middle Eastern cinema chapter and something on Persian cinema. But once we started adding in these shorter essays and once we hit our word limit count, it was like, okay, we have covered a lot. We could say more about South American cinema. We could say more about probably Soviet adjacent cinema, probably more about Hong Kong cinema we could have fit in here, although that's a little bit trickier because they do have some restrictions. Could do 10 of these volumes.
I think Latin America. Yeah, I think Latin America and South America was certainly one area that we could have just done a huge amount more. There's nothing from Mexico. There's nothing from a number of the Latin American countries, Cuba. Yeah, there's a sort of outtake on some of the films in Argentina. And there's also one about George Sanguinis, who was a Bolivian director, but there was so much. And of course, we've mentioned Scott's essay about the sort of unlikely connections between Glauber Rocha and Jose Marines. But we could have done so much more about Latin America and really gone deep into that. I discovered, and you constantly discover, as you're doing these books, it's like the same when I was doing the pulp and popular fiction books, you're always finding stuff. And then when the book is finished and comes out, you're still finding stuff. I came across Robert Kramer's work quite late in the book. So there's a short essay on his 1970 film about a revolution in America, in the United States, in New York, called Ice. But there's so much more. It would have been great to have another chapter on him. Oh, we could have gone to town on so much more French and Italian. And as you say, Sam, Eastern European stuff that we could have covered.
My probably biggest regret is that I wasn't. So when I was digging around trying to make a list of potential films from North Africa and the Middle East to include, I found some Lebanese films that I would have liked to have written about, but I was trying really hard to find Palestinian films that would qualify. And I don't think we've talked about this in the episode yet, but our parameters were the Cold War, so roughly 1955 to the very early 90s, around 1990, and no documentaries. And the only Palestinian films I could find surviving from the 70s were documentaries because everything else was just destroyed or confiscated. I'm sure something is out there, and there's probably a Palestinian cinema expert who would be like, oh, yes, duh, you should have written about this. But
you're both so super film literate. Were there titles that surprised you where you said, oh, I've never heard of this before? It sounds like maybe Robert Kramer was a little bit of a surprise for you, Andrew. What else really stuck out and then also delighted you when you finally got to see it?
For me, and Andrew brought this up, but when I was writing my Youssef Chahine Egyptian cinema essay, finding that he made this film called Jamila the Algerian, which is about this real life figure, Jamila Bouhared, who was a female freedom fighter. And to have an Egyptian film from the late 50s made while the Algerian War was occurring, focused almost exclusively on the female characters, like absolutely blew my mind. And I wish that one was included with this Criterion Channel series, but it really changed a lot about how I thought about Middle Eastern cinema, even considering that a film like that existed, where it's all about women just bombing the shit out of their colonial oppressors, basically, but also with melodrama and romance and a musical number.
And the theme song to Gone with the Wind, which is repurposed at dramatic points of the film, which is terrific. Yeah, Kramer was certainly a interesting discovery for me. Revisiting some of those films that Kimberly wrote about in her chapter on American campus revolt films was really good. I mean, I would talked about how we could have done so much more on sort of South America, but the George Sanguinis films, he was a sort of Bolivian new cinema director who had a very strong anti-colonial the Bolivian Indians perspective in his films, and then eventually fell foul of the military dictatorship in a military government in Bolivia and moved about the place making films. His stuff is really pretty incredible, especially given that it's made on an absolute shoestring. Some of his films, there's one particular film he makes, it's a 1969 film, which is not an unknown film, called Blood of the Condor, which is essentially based on stories that were in pretty sure it's the Bolivian press, about how members of the Peace Corps were sterilizing Bolivian Indian women as part of their activities. And it's all about that and about the revolt against these Peace Corps, but from this particular Indian village, the revolt against these Peace Corps workers. That's a really interesting film. Some of the Argentinian films are really interesting. These aren't hard to find films, but I personally got a lot out. There's a chapter I wrote in there about Teskey films, but also just talking specifically about those films that combine their crime plot with vaguely defined right-wing conspiracies to destroy the Italian state and to usher in a right-wing dictatorship, of which there are a surprisingly large number in the Polizia Teskey canon of films. Watching those was terrific. There's one particular film, 1979, I think it is. It's a Damiani film called I Am Afraid, with our man Volante. That was a particular highlight of those films. But yeah, there's some great films in that lot as well. It was great watching all of those together as well.
You also wrote this chapter about Patty Hearst exploitation movies that kind of blew my mind a little bit, because I didn't realize there were so many of them.
Of course there were, including sort of Patty Hearst porn film or Patty Hearst sort of sexploitation films.
Oh, yeah. Patty. Isn't it just called that?
I think it was called.
Okay, because there's one called Patty by Robert L. Roberts that I've been looking for forever.
So how are there so many filmmakers exploiting history?
Because she was a pop culture feeding frenzy, wasn't she? The story of an heiress to a fortune who then turns into a revolutionary, is photographed robbing a bank, and around that, the whole air of the sexual air that she's potentially sleeping with her captors and all of that is tabloid manna from heaven.
How long did it actually take to put this whole thing together?
So the pandemic has really warped my sense of time, possibly aging as well has done that. So I want to say about 2 years. Is that right?
About 1.5 years, I think.
Didn't take that long in the grand scheme of things.
It feels like it must have taken a lot longer just because of the depth of the material and then just how good the book looks. Who did your layout for this?
Brian Lang, Layng. I'm pretty sure is the layout guy.
It looks so beautiful.
Ramsey has at times made comments to me about how expensive some of the previous books I've done for him have been. Some of those pulp and popular fiction books, which are also full color illustrated books. And so I said, oh, look, there may be just a few black and white photos, Ramsey. We don't need a lot, just a couple of things. And they said, oh, no, I think we should make it full color. That increases the appeal of the book. And they've just done an absolutely stupendous job on this.
That part is so important because so much of the marketing for these films, like so many incredible posters and promo images, and I don't think it would be nearly as dynamic without showing so much of that. So boring to most people.
Which is something we strenuously wanted to avoid.
Well, the cover price is not that bad compared to how thick and juicy this book is.
Better than working with an academic publisher where you're not really allowed to include color images, and a book half that size, they're like, all right, that'll be $80.
You mean like 140, 150?
In US dollars. I feel like PM Press have been so great to work with, and some of it is they seem very aware that they're trying to put together a book package that people will want to read, like making it easier for people. Whereas so many other publishing companies that I've worked for seem to not want people to read or buy the books. It's like, why are you guys in business?
PM's thing is really about getting books in the hands of people. Ramsey's a massive bibliophile. He's constantly lamenting to me the fact that people aren't reading as much as they used to. So the whole thing is constantly trying to get books, as good books as possible, at the cheapest price possible, and move them as much as possible into people who will read them. PM Press, they are a radical publisher. PM Press, obviously a distributor that gets the books into shops, but they do a large number of festivals, concerts, political events. They're always having tables at all these sort of conferences and events where they move books. They do a lot of stuff on music, punk and punk culture, and anarchist culture. They do some tremendous stuff. They also released, I noticed, because there's an ad in the back of our book for them, they also released a book on the Angry Brigade, which was this British urban guerrilla group in the 1970s. So I'm going to have to pick that up. And they also put out a 2-volume documentary history of the Red Army faction.
This is the struggle. Every time I go on their website, I just want to buy everything. And so they're going to have I don't know when this episode is coming out, but on Sunday the 29th, they are doing the Brooklyn Book Festival, and I'm going to go and sign things. And I feel like I'm going to have to leave my wallet at home because I know I'm going to want to buy everything that they have at this table.
Yeah, tell me about some of the events that you're doing to support the book.
My first event is on Wednesday the 25th at Philomoka in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. I'm doing a secret screening of a Japanese pinky violence movie, all about very angry teenage girls, of course, played by early to mid-20s actresses, destroying a high school. And then I will be at the Brooklyn Book Festival on the 29th. I think my next event, that tickets aren't for sale yet, but October 28th, I'm doing a screening at the Nighthawk in Brooklyn. I'm showing this German film called Bloody Friday that had script contributions from Fernando de Leo. So if you like his Poliziotteschi films, you have an idea what to expect, but it's basically a very violent German crime movie where the bank robbers are politically motivated. And then I'm doing a couple of events in Chicago in the middle of November. And I'm booking things for LA in January. So I will have all of those posted on Instagram once tickets become available.
And Andrew, are you doing anything over in Melbourne for this?
I'm not doing any events over in Melbourne. I am doing a lot of podcasts and various other activities online to try and gee up support for the book. Envious of Samm being in Rep Cinema Central over there in New York. We
It's
often talk
paradise
about
here.
that. It is paradise. Paradise on the, yes, that's right.
Is there a volume 2 in the works?
People keep asking me this, and I'm like, I don't know. This just came out.
Yeah, give us a break. Give us a sec.
I know that you both work on a ton of things all the time, though, so I wouldn't put it past you.
That definitely was the struggle. Like we were saying earlier, I feel like the struggle of this is once you go down these different national, like regional rabbit holes, it's, now here's a list of 400 other movies that we could include. So we certainly could do a second volume, but I think because this just came out, it's a little bit hard to tell how into it people are. And I think working with a publisher, if you want to do a second volume, they need some hard evidence that the first volume is well received.
I have no doubt that people are going to eat this up because it is so good. And I had such a good time. Other than that one essay about Peter Watkins, everything else in that book is fantastic. Good stuff, guys.
The guy who did that essay was a bit late with his contribution, I seem to remember. We had to constantly get him, come on, get it to us.
Oh, yeah. Sounds about right. You can tell it's written under duress.
Yeah, I hear he does a bit of podcasting, so you might have been busy.
Yeah,
Slacker.
he's not busy. He just hangs out and watches a lot of Drag Race.
Hangs out in the hot tub watching Drag Race.
Living the dream.
Now I've switched over to Guy Mont's spelling bee, so I don't know if you've had a chance to watch that one, but definitely check it out.
I don't even know what that is.
No, I have no idea what that even is.
I can't remember if he's from New Zealand or if he's from Australia, but Guy Montgomery. I'm a big fan of the Australian Taskmaster as well as the Kiwi Taskmaster.
What's Taskmaster? This is a whole world that I don't know about.
Taskmaster's this great TV show. Oh my gosh, I'll have to send you guys.
Sounds like a sort of teen YA novel sort of series, Taskmaster.
Is it a reality TV show?
It's basically 5 comedians and they make them do stupid things and they record them doing it. And then they bring them back to the studio and they replay the stupid things that they did and get their reactions from it. And then they're judged by the Taskmaster and he gives them points for how well or not well they did on these things.
Yeah, this is like most reality television and this kind of like performative reaction television is a whole world that I am not familiar with.
It is hilarious, I have to say. So it's really good stuff. When you are not writing books, Andrew, where can people find you online?
They can find me blasted all over social media, often under the moniker Pulp Curry. And they can also find me doing a Substack newsletter under my own name, Andrew Nette, on Substack.
And Sam, how about yourself?
You can find me on Instagram under my own name, very boringly, and also on Patreon. And I think those are the only 2 places I'm online.
And where's the best place to buy the book?
Through PM Press. At this point, I think it's available through most online booksellers from what people have been telling me. Also, Diabolic DVD is selling it. So if you're on there to buy some Blu-rays, please add it to your cart. Vinegar Syndrome should also have it on their store soon.
I think it should be out. Yes, it's basically on all the online platforms. You can also get it via the Great Satan, Amazon. And you can obviously buy it from PM Press. In terms of in stores, it should be hitting US bookstores round about now.
Yeah, someone wrote me a day or 2 ago saying they found it in a Chicago bookstore. I was really?
So that's starting to come out. That's great. UK people, it should be out the distributor should be getting it sometime in early October. Australian peeps, hey, that's
best of luck.
The distributor will be getting it out, but I also have copies. Hunt me down and get a copy off me.
Sam and Andrew, thank you so much for your time. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
hang out, but you won't fool the children of the revolution. Now you won't fool the children of the revolution. Now, well, you tear a plane in the falling rain. I drive a Rolls Royce, 'cause it's good for my voice. But you won't fool the children of the revolution. Now you won't fool the children of the revolution.